This part of the video is going to describe how to join pieces of fabric together to form the rectangle quilt back. And you have to be aware of some things when you go to stay stitch. Both of these pieces of fabric are right side up. Right side up in fusible quiltering fleece is the side without the fusing agent, so that's the right side. Now, as far as stay stitching, you always have to stay stitch opposite sides of the fabric. So if you're going to stay stitch this corner of the fusible interfacing, and I'm on the right side, and I'm just going to draw a line using an erasable marking pen. If you stay stitch this side and you stay stitch this side of the quilt back, when you go to position the pieces to one another to sew them together, this is the side where the stay stitching was. It won't match up. Instead, you have to do mirror images. So if I stay stitch this side on the fleece, I have to stay stitch this side on the back. Now if you make an error, it's no big deal. Just reposition the stay stitching on the fleece. You don't have to rip any of it out because that stitching's not going to show anyway. In this case, both these sides were stay stitched correctly. So here's my stay stitching on the back, and here's the side where my stay stitching is on the fleece. I'm going to position them so the stay stitching stacks up on the same side. And then I'm going to pin the pieces together and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew from this side to this side. My stitch length is pretty small. I don't have to back stitch here if it's anywhere under 2 millimeters my stitch length. But when I get to this edge, because it's got stay stitching, that's the edge I'm going to use to flip the back to the outside when I pull it through. I am going to back stitch here. So you see I've sewn this row of stitching, and the piece of back is way bigger than the fleece, and that's intentional. So the next seam I usually put in is the one at the opposite side of the one I first put in. And it doesn't make any difference that the back is bigger than the fleece because you're just going to match the raw edges. When I match the raw edges, I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam across this side. I'm not going to tack it or back tack it or anything because I'm using a stitch length of 1.8. With these two sides sewn, you can see that there's a lot of extra back fabric. That's intentional. Just match the raw edges and sew this seam. Here's the row of stitching I just made, and then I'm just going to match up this final side and stitch that as well. Raw edges of the fleece to the raw edge of the back, and just sew straight across. All 4 edges of my rectangle are sewn. This fabric, there's a lot of excessive fabric on the back. I'm going to get ready to pull this right side out through the stay stitched opening. Before I do that, this quilter's fleece is not really meant to fold that much, so I'm going to trim all of it to approximately half its original width. Trim the quilter's fleece next to the stitching to approximately 1/8 of an inch. And that'll help the fabric lay nicely after it's flipped. After all 4 sides have been sewn together and the quilter's batting has been trimmed, it's ready to turn this right sides out. Notice I did not touch the fabric, only the quilter's fleece. I'm going to pull my fabric through the stay stitched edge. The stay stitching will reduce the amount of distortion that'll happen as you turn the fabric to the right side. When I turn pieces right sides out and they are long and there's a lot of fabric, the first thing I do is I gently force a little bit of the fabric through the opening like this. Eventually it's going to be very thick to turn this, so when that starts to happen, I take the fabric that hasn't been turned and I twist it into a column, compressing it, and then I gently pull the opening over that column. I just continue doing that until everything's on the inside of that opening. I'm trying not to pull on the stay stitched edge too much, because even though it's stay stitched, it will distort the fabric at that edge. Once the fabric has been flipped and the right side is out, you'll notice these ridges above the lining where the back is pulled towards the center of the quilt back piece. And that's exactly what we want. This is going to be taken to the ironing board and pressed because there's a fusing agent. So make sure these edges look even as possible. Also, if I have an opportunity to let the stay stitched edge rest overnight, I usually do that, because even though I've been careful about pulling the fabric through, sometimes this edge can get distorted. I might even steam it a little before I actually finish pressing all of this in place.